Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the afternoon session. I hope you all had an enjoyable lunch. My name is Rasmus Bertelsen, a Danish national who grew up in Iceland, professor of Northern Studies and Barnesian Politics at UIT, the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø, and this academic year, the Nansen Professor of Arctic Studies at University of Akureyri in Northern Iceland. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce this session here. I look forward to your questions, comments. This session on science diplomacy. I'm very happy to have two good colleagues with me here today, Dr. Marc Lanteigne, international relations and China scholar, also at UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, and Dr. Eyjólfur Guðmundsson, Rector of the University of Akureyri. We were also supposed to be joined by His Excellency Omran Sharan, Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs and Science. Because of the switch in schedule, he was not available this afternoon. So unfortunately he cannot join us, which is a great pity, because he was also in charge of the Emirati space program, if I understand correct, and the Mars mission. So it would have been very interesting to hear his remarks on the role of science diplomacy in Emirati foreign policy. But that, of course, gives us a little bit more time for discussion, which I'm sure there'll be plenty of. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson mentioned this panel before lunch, talking about the hopes and aspirations for the role of science diplomacy, and that science diplomacy could help bring different parties together, parties that may be in conflict, well, originally with 3 speakers, I would just have limited myself to introducing and moderating, but now I will use the opportunity to speak a little bit more about what I have been doing in science diplomacy and to introduce the topic of science diplomacy before we turn over to Eyjólfur and Marc. So I had the great opportunity, the great pleasure of being part of a Horizon 2020 project on European science diplomacy. Of course, Horizon 2020 was the European Union's research program from, I think, 13 to 2020. Now it's the Horizon Europe. So if I can ask for the first slide, Mathildur, and Mathildur has been very flexible and helpful. She got those slides about 3 minutes ago. Yes, so I had the pleasure of being a work package leader in Inside, inventing a shared science diplomacy for Europe, which was coordinated by Professor of History at Sorbonne, Pascal Grisset. And Inside was mainly a science and technology history program, where I was one of the few political scientists. I directed the work package proposing European science diplomacy theory and strategy. And Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, if I remember right, I think he said something like that science diplomacy was a new phenomenon. And that is something that this project here would question. The concept of the term science diplomacy is quite recent, 10, 15 years. But the practice of science diplomacy, which can be defined as the foreign and security policy use of scientific collaboration, that's a very, very old practice. It goes back hundreds of years, where states have used science and technology collaboration for foreign policy purposes. So to introduce the concept of science diplomacy briefly, In 2010, I think it was, the British Royal Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science launched a report on science diplomacy, which has been very influential. And that report gave 3 categorizations of science diplomacy, which are hotly debated, but I think they're very useful for talking about science diplomacy. And the first is science in diplomacy. So that is when you put scientific knowledge into diplomatic negotiations, etc. And I think IPCC is probably a textbook example of science in diplomacy. Einar Gunnarsson, who I'm not sure is with us right now, but Einar Gunnarsson, ambassador, talking about the Arctic Council, he talked about all the knowledge work in the working groups. That's perhaps also an example of science in diplomacy. Then the next category is diplomacy for science, and that is when states agree to facilitate, fund, etc., scientific cooperation. So personally, being a professor in northern Norway, I benefited very much from the very extensive Norwegian-Russian Barents cooperation, where Norway made a lot of resources available. And that collaboration is, of course, all now frozen. But example of diplomacy for science, for example, Norway invested a good deal in such academic relations with Russia. And then finally, the category which is most often talked about for science diplomacy is science for diplomacy. And that is when academic connections, they create transnational networks, personal relationships, epistemic communities, which are more robust than political relations, and that these scientific relations can perhaps continue to function even in political conflict. But I also think that there's been too much optimism about the resilience, the independence of this science for diplomacy. I think what we see right now around the war in Ukraine, we see very clearly in Europe how dependent academia, how dependent science is on government policy. That if government policy decrees that you cannot continue this collaboration, well, then this collaboration goes away. That is not a historically unique example, and as I mentioned before, science diplomacy as a phenomenon has a long pedigree. One can just mention, for example, that before, in the late 1800s, first half of the 20th century, there were more than 20 American missionary higher education institutions in mainland China. And they did not survive the Korean War, and that was both the United States government and the People's Republic of China that did not tolerate these bicultural institutions. Mathildur, if I can just have the last slide and then we'll get going. So the European Union funded 3 Horizon 2020 science diplomacy projects, and they live on in the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance, science-diplomacy.eu, which I recommend you to look at, which brings together the European Commission, the European External Action Service, and these research communities. So this was a brief introduction to science diplomacy and science diplomacy research. And now I would like to hand over to Eyjólfur, who, as rector, and as a very active rector at an Arctic university, and very active in the University of the Arctic. Eyjólfur, I'm looking very much forward to your remarks from a university leadership position about an Arctic university in science diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Then you should have given me 5 months to prepare. Now, thank you all for being here with us today, and it's great that I actually made it. It looked like I wouldn't make it here, so I just came last night. So I'm very happy to be here. Came from minus 15 degrees Celsius 24 hours ago, so a little bit of a climate change for me personally. Science diplomacy is, in my opinion, the key to solving the problems that we talked about this morning. There is no other way than utilizing science on all of the 3 levels that Rasmus talked about in order to be able to acquire a solution. And I want to give you one example. Back in 1986, there was a leadership summit between Reagan and Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland. Some say it was a failed venture, others say it was the beginning of a conversation. What we know for sure is that around that time, and perhaps exactly on that meeting, the 2 great powers agreed, based on scientific methods and calculations on both sides, that a nuclear war would be a catastrophic event for the world. And since both sides agreed, they were able to continue and finally resolve the Cold War. Now, if we are now faced with a different situation because we didn't follow through well enough, is another question that Rasmus mentioned here earlier with regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this is, for me, a prime example of how science needs to be the core of what we are doing. I was in Monaco last week, and Prince Albert II, he reminded us that was participating in that event that when universities were kind of re-established back in the Dark Ages, specifically the University of Paris, that that was a place where you could come and discuss all matters, all geopolitics were left outside. This is the core of the academic freedom. So with academic freedom, with the opportunity to be able to discuss all sides of the matter, using scientific approaches, we are able to go cross cultural barriers and find these solutions. This sounds straightforward and this sounds simple. Yet, in my opinion, as we have been talking about this morning, we are running out of time in the fight against global warming. On the climate issues, we have had the science for more than 30 years. We have COP28 coming up. And yet we are faced with the very fact that our solutions have not worked well enough so far. So science diplomacy has indeed failed in getting the message across. So what I would like to discuss with you here today is what else can we do at the universities in order to be more active participants in the solutions, which is why I was very pleased to hear the presentation here earlier today about COP being about actions and how science and universities can be behind those actions so they do truly cross boundaries, cross borders, and make life more equitable for everyone. Isn't that good enough beginning? Have I finished my 5 minutes? I have about 17 other minutes here that I can use later.
Thank you very much, Eyjólfur. That was very good point of departure for our discussion. Marc, China IR scholar.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rasmus, and also let me convey my thanks to the organizers of this conference. It's been a very impressive and interesting few days. Before I begin, just full disclosure, I am also a political scientist, and I will try to keep the amount of political theory in this presentation down to a relative minimum. Just so you know, the final exam will be at 4:30 down the hall. You heard it here first. So I want to talk a little bit about one major player in the area of science diplomacy in the Arctic and the polar regions, and that's been China. Now, it's been 5 years now since Beijing published its white paper on the Arctic, under a great deal of scrutiny, under a great deal of discussion. But we still have a lot of questions about what is China seeking in the Arctic and in the polar regions as a whole. And this particular subject is complex and getting more so, but I would argue that there are three pillars that China is pursuing with its Arctic policy, with the overall aim, I should say, to being seen as an Arctic stakeholder. Now, one term which has been analyzed and critiqued quite a bit is when we started to see the term Jinbeiji Guojia start to circulate in Chinese policy, near Arctic state. Now, this obviously caused a bit of discussion. If you look at a map, you will see that China is not very close to the Arctic, and yet this is still being looked at very carefully as part of China's Arctic interests. Now, contrary to popular belief, there's been a few interesting interpretations of where this term came from. It actually has its origins in academia, round about 2010, likely earlier. And this was at a time where China was very concerned about what was happening in the Arctic, concerned that with the discussion about resources, the discussion about trade routes, that the Arctic was in serious danger of simply being relegated to the 8 Arctic states. And if you were not an Arctic state, you would basically have no say and get no benefit. So over the past decade, it has been a priority for Beijing to portray itself as a very important Arctic actor. 3 pillars which are important here. Science diplomacy, which I will be talking about, is one of them. The other 2 are economics and governance. Now, one could argue that there's a very ill-defined 4th pillar starting to appear, security, and I'm happy to bring that up in the questions. But scientific cooperation has been a cornerstone of what China is seeking to do in the Arctic, and there are some very interesting parallels, some of which were discussed in the sessions this morning, about how China is making use of its extensive scientific work in the Third Pole Himalaya region, how that is being translated, how that expertise is being moved towards the Arctic itself. Now, like many other countries, China is certainly not alone in the sense that there have been significant connections being made between changed conditions in the Arctic and what is happening in China itself. I can point to very cold weather in Shanghai during the winter. I could point to freak rainstorms in Beijing. I can point to considerably changed snowfall and pollution patterns, wind patterns, most of which have been tracked right back to the Arctic. So, like many other non-Arctic states who are very active in the region, China simply wants to know what is happening. Because that is the underlying theme that, one of the themes I want to make here, is that China is still a newcomer to the polar regions, including in comparison to other non-Arctic states, including in Europe and in Asia. And a lot of what China is seeking to do in the polar regions, including the Arctic, is to just accumulate information. Because the second point here is that you can't buy information. You can't simply say, okay, I'm going to invest so-and-so and get the information I need. You need people with notebooks. You need a particular agenda. And this has been a priority for Beijing, at least as far back as the past decade, when China first started to set up research stations in Svalbard and the research stations that have been set up in Antarctica. Now, because China is requiring this information, it's also been understood that China simply cannot address this alone. We heard about the various forms of cooperation in the Hindu Kush region that China has been trying to, despite, we were talking about political issues before, to try to accumulate that knowledge by gaining regional understanding. And China's been attempting to do the same thing in the Arctic, although at the moment to mixed success. Now, how China is accomplishing this, though, is very key. China is the largest non-Arctic state. One could argue that India is certainly up there as well, but in terms of its size and in terms of the amount of influence that it is able to bring to bear on the region, China's in a very distinct position. And Beijing has been very wary of being seen as a gatecrasher or a spoiler in either the Arctic or the Himalaya region. So how China has been able to approach this, to say on one hand, yes, I want to be a stakeholder, I want to be taken seriously as a regional actor, without looking like it is being revisionist, the way that China has been pursuing this is through what IR scholars have been referred to as relational theory. This means that relations between actors on the international level are seen as important, they are seen as fluid, changing, and they are necessary in order to accumulate knowledge, power, diplomacy, and so forth. One major practitioner in China of this theory, Chen Yaqing, he explained it really well. He said that you're playing chess, and obviously knowing where each of the pieces are is sort of important, but you need to know the squares. So we know the actors when it comes to both the Arctic and the Himalaya region, but what about the squares? In some cases, the amount of moves that one can make change considerably, depending on what others are doing. Sometimes information is there, sometimes information is lacking. So China's put a great deal of focus on maintaining certain relationships and in some ways trying to transcend other political and diplomatic areas. Now, how this is important to the third pole is very key here, because China has really tried to stress that it wants to play a very supporting role, strong role, in the fighting of ice erosion and understanding exactly what is happening in the region, because China is being affected by, obviously, the ice erosion in the Himalayas as well. But because it is still trying to play catch-up in many ways to really understand what is happening on the ground, to get more people educated, to get more people on the ground with their notebooks, this kind of cooperation is important, and understanding the relationships are very important. Now, there's been a lot of very good literature over the past few years on what China is specifically seeking to do in the Qinghai Tibet Plateau. That's been pretty much the focus of China's activities. So what I'm interested in is how China is trying to translate both of these regions, the Arctic and the Hindu Kush, into not only an effective base of knowledge, but also a particular diplomatic tool. Now, to conclude, because I do want to open up for questions, the political situation, obviously, with China in both regions is quite complex. At the same time, China's domestic, I should say, situation has also become much more complicated just over the past few months. China has to make a lot of very difficult decisions regarding its foreign policy, and that will extend into its environmental policy. There's a lot of questions right now about China's short-term economic health. We've heard quite a bit just recently about socioeconomic issues. So for all of the discussion about China's rise in the Arctic, China's rise in the polar regions, that has to be tempered with the fact that domestically China is going to have to make some very difficult decisions, many of which will have to impact on its scientific diplomacy. Now, one last quick point. China and Russia, there's been a great deal of papers and goodwill about scientific cooperation. How is that going to be affected under current circumstances? So what I would end with is that if you're going to be looking at scientific diplomacy, not only is it important to look at the patterns, the actors, but also the idea of relationships, because they do matter, and I would say that China is certainly not the only country that's really paying attention to the relationships. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc. And I think we've had very thought-provoking remarks, which should open up for a lot of questions. I just want to make one point, following up on what Eyjólfur was saying, and what Eyjólfur was talking about climate science and whether science diplomacy has been effective. There was one point which I didn't make in my introduction, and that is science means different things in different languages. And of course, English is the predominant language in many of these conversations. And native English speakers here can correct me, but I would say that de facto science in English means natural sciences. Whereas, for example, in German or in Scandinavian languages, Wissenschaft is much broader. So Wissenschaft or Wissenschaft means all disciplines, social sciences, natural sciences, humanities, technology, health, etc. And Eyjólfur's remark about the ineffectiveness of climate science diplomacy reminded me of that, because I basically think that a problem about climate science diplomacy is that it's far too narrowly natural scientific. Eyjólfur, I know you're an economist. I did a bit of economics, but you're a real economist. I'm just an amateur economist. I basically see climate change as a game theoretical problem. And more and more natural science is not going to solve that game theoretical problem. And if we assume also our colleagues in STEM, in science and technology, they often have an assumption that if only people knew, they would act in a desired way. Whereas, of course, very clearly in game theory, we know very well that people can know perfectly well and still cheat. And it may especially be if they know perfectly well, then they cheat. So I just wanted to bring up that topic. Before I give comments, questions from the audience.
Sorry.
Yeah. Maxime.
Okay.
And then Meet.
Thank you for your interesting report. Maxim Gutyunov, Chelyabinsk, Russia, South Ural State University, and this year St. Petersburg State University. Science diplomacy became extremely popular since 2009 after London's report, and we have many dimensions, we have many interpretation what is science diplomacy. And first approach, we all consider science diplomacy as a tool for building bridges between nations where relationship is not so good. And many scientists suppose that it's much popular, it's better, it's more effective than classical diplomacy. However, it seems to be now that it doesn't work well. And as Marc mentioned, we see non-Arctic countries like China, Korea, Japan, etc. And they also like to use science diplomacy. And sometimes it seems to me there is a different approach, like science diplomacy as a tool of soft power, but not as a tool for building great relationship. How do you think, first part of my question, how do you think, is it, which approach is popular, first or second? And the second part, how science diplomacy can help to make relationship between European Union and Russia much better? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we should collect a couple of questions. Meet, I saw you indicating.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. I wanted to comment really on two things. First off, with science diplomacy, as you're giving your talk, Rasmus, I was sending a note to my friend Von Tarikian, who is head of international affairs at AAAS and now is at the National Academy and was the Secretary of State's science advisor and really has pushed creation of science diplomacy awards and so forth. And so you know, besides the fact that his father was one of my favorite professors, he was the assistant to the Undersecretary of the State who had Paula Dobriansky, who had the Arctic Council in her jurisdiction for a long time. So there's been a very close tie between American science diplomacy. Also wanted to say just to the Russian science diplomacy, during the time that our Senator Ted Stevens from Alaska was head of the observers group for the US Senate on arms control talks during the 80s. Evgeny Velikov, head of the Kurchatov Institute in Russia, which developed Russia's hydrogen bomb and has been one of the world's leaders in pushing for ITER, for fusion research, was head of the Russian observer group. And I brought Velikov to a dinner in Washington, and he knew more senators in the room than most of the senators knew in the room. He was well established there, and working between Russia and Japan, we were able to get the George W. Bush administration to support getting back into the fusion research. So I have to say that developing science relationships is very, very important, and you've got that there. Marc, you and I can have a conversation offline a little bit about near-Arctic nations, but I remember President Guðmundsson in China and others talking to the Chinese about using the term near-Arctic state. And I was a government official meeting with the leader of China where my other colleagues were being exhorted to sell more corn out of Nebraska and soybeans out of Alabama. And I said to the president of China, I said, I can't really put any big numbers on your scoreboard. But if you don't realize that the Arctic is, if you send an iPhone to Europe, if you send an iPhone to North America, it stops for gas in Alaska. If you don't understand the Arctic routes and why when you go to Washington, you go that way. And I guess I'll say that the business community in China discovered the Arctic probably before the political community did and before the science community did. Because so much of their international air traffic is related to it, so much of their if you go to Dalian, the region which is really the biggest smelting region of in the world and for minerals, you'll find that most of those large amount of those supplies come out of the Arctic. And so I would just say that when we have talked about the near Arctic relationship with China, we are talking more about the economic relationship than say the the geopolitical one.
Thank you, Mead. Oliver?
Well, of course, we could continue telling stories about Velikov. Velikov actually was very interesting Russian scientist, head of the Academy of Sciences, probably the foremost nuclear scientist in Russia, gained world fame when he entered the nuclear disaster area that happened in what's now Ukraine. But I was reminded when you talked about Velikov, in the story of this famous summit between Reagan and Gorbachev, the reason why it broke up was that Reagan said, I'm willing to agree with you to give up nuclear weapons completely, which was a revolutionary statement from an American president, if you allow me to keep my Star Wars program. And when Margaret Thatcher learned of this, she got so angry at this offer from Reagan, because that meant the British would lose their nuclear deterrent, that she flew uninvited to Washington to protest. But a week before, because Velikov was also at that summit, he was part of the Gorbachev delegation. A week before, he had published from the Russian Academy of Science a scientific report demonstrating to Gorbachev that the Star Wars program would never work. It was scientifically completely unsound. And I have often wondered why Gorbachev didn't believe the science advice and gave Reagan, therefore, his Star Wars, because his scientist had told him, Gorbachev, it would never work. So it was cheap to give Reagan that dream. It was a primary historical example of the failure of science diplomacy, if I may put it that way. But I stood up primarily to make a point about China, following what you said. Because I don't think there is a coordination in China between what they do in the third pole and what they do in the Arctic. At least it has to be proved to me if that's so. And the reason why I say that is that I've been working with China now for almost 20 years on both these issues. And in terms of the Chinese government, they are completely separate. The Arctic is a part of the Ministry of Natural Resources. And the Polar Institute of China belongs to that. The third pole under the Tibetan Plateau Institute is under the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And there's absolutely zero connection between the two. And what I discovered as president in my encounters with them, they had never talked to each other. So for about a year or so, my mission to them is, look here guys, you're both studying ice. One of you is studying ice in the Arctic, the other is studying ice up in the Himalayas. You have to start talking to each other. But we are still experiencing the problem in running the Arctic Circle, that within the Chinese government, there is a firewall, a bureaucratic firewall, between the Arctic and the Third Pole. And I am not yet found a way to get around that bureaucratic ministerial firewall, because the Academy of Sciences in China is preoccupied with maintaining its own bureaucratic status, whereas the Ministry of Natural Resources, of course, is as preoccupied with keeping its status. So I think we should hesitate in bringing into our analysis of China our own governmental model of assuming people are very clever and rational and coordinate. And I have often said stupidity is often more relevant explanatory factor than actually rational decisions. So I just wanted to make that point. But the Velikov story brought back this important example of monumental failure in science diplomacy.
Thank you very much, Eyjólfur. Do I understand correctly that we have 10 minutes left? Okay. I suggest that we respond to these comments. Eyjólfur, will you go ahead, and then Marc, and then I can conclude. And then please let's have a second round of questions. And I see one question there, and yeah, Eyjólfur, please go ahead.
Thank you. With regard to the second question on Russia and the EU, and with the dialogue around China, and me being a rector of a small university up in the Arctic, it's only a 20-minute flight from my hometown and north of the Arctic Circle. All I want to say about it is this. In difficult times, you never close off opportunities for dialogue. Because if you close off the opportunity for dialogue, then you definitely have an enemy on your hand. So in the Arctic, we should still communicate, and we should have the authority to have dialogue with other scientists based on scientific facts, and also social scientific facts. Because you know right away when it is true and when it is, if to quote my former president, plainly stupid. So you have the facts to discuss on a scientific basis in an academic environment. The difficulty becomes when we hit the point that Rasmus was talking about earlier. We need to include more social sciences in the global climate issue, as well as in the issue on the conflicts that we're having around the world. And just to give you an example of what I'm thinking with regard to this messaging and how we have dialogue and discuss things, us academics tend to think everything is rational and there's a reason and there's a truth. Regular people are dealing with their monthly budget on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. Scientists are asking them to change the behavior towards the negative, to have less, to not travel, to not do, to not do, to not do. What do you do when somebody says not do, not do, not do, not do, don't do? You become negative. So it must be, both with regard to the question on Russia and EU, and with regard to the climate change, that we increase the science in diplomacy, in dialogue and discussion, and in solutions. But we broaden the approach. I agree with Rasmus on that. We have to have more political science in there. So basically, we need to change the message to a positive one. What is a sustainable consumption? How can we increase your livelihood, better your life, with increased yet sustainable consumption? And I will use the electric car as an example. The Western world is discovering that the electric car is more fun to drive, cheaper to operate, and it's probably going to last longer. So it's just an economic question. Earlier this morning, we talked about the use of geothermal heating in Iceland. It was indeed a cost-effective solution, and we are really glad today that we have geothermal heating of our houses. Purely economic decision that has a sustainable consequence. That's what we need.
Thank you, Eyjólfur. Marc.
Thank you. Excellent questions. Just very quick point on the subject of soft power and China. Certainly soft power is very much part of China's equation. When I was saying before that it was very interested in being accepted as an Arctic stakeholder, not necessarily a neo-Arctic state. But I would add to that what China's also trying to do, and another international relations term, China's really trying to be a norm entrepreneur. It is trying to create a norm to say, look, there are certain areas, certain space where non-Arctic states could and should have a say. Not challenging current international law, not challenging current regimes, but there's a space there. That there needs to be certain input, including in the area of science diplomacy, where non-Arctic states, especially large ones like China, could and should have a role. So I'd say that's another kind of part of what China's seeking to do in regards to soft power. Mr. President, yes, I'm certainly not going to argue that stovepiping in the Chinese bureaucracy is not a problem, because I had the good fortune of sorts to visit the State Oceanic Administration in Beijing just as it was shutting down. It was about to be folded into the Ministry of Natural Resources. Boxes everywhere. And it really demonstrated the fact that there are quite a bit of separate kind of areas, ministries, and areas of expertise just looking at the Arctic and Antarctic. That said, you go down a few levels. You go to the informal relations between the bureaucracies, especially when, at a time when China was really trying to prove its expertise. It was put under a great deal of pressure by other Arctic governments, by the general community to say, okay, you want to become an observer, show your credentials, show your capabilities. So you had a great deal of informal, very quiet dialogues between bureaucracies and primarily between academics and experts. Very difficult to track, and I completely agree, they do not move fast, and very often they do run into walls. But it is still a very significant factor, especially when we're trying to translate the hard science into actual diplomacy. But thank you very much for your comments.
I will respond very quickly to what Maxine was saying before Madeleine Redfern's question. What you say about science diplomacy and two kinds of science diplomacy, I think it's very important to have a cool-headed view of science diplomacy, that there has been this very, very optimistic, very positive view of science diplomacy, where I think it's important to keep in mind that it is diplomacy, it's pursuing state interests. And that is something that's very strange for small Nordic countries, but if you look at countries like France, Britain, the United States, they use education also very consciously as foreign policy tools. I mean, we are in a region which has American associated universities, French associated, British associated, which shape elites, form elites, and that has been, especially for France, that has been government policy since the 1880s. And then, Maxine, to your second question, there's one thing that I'm a little bit hopeful about, and that is that personal relations last. And I think we have, especially the last 30 years, I see in the Barents region, we have invested a lot in personal relationships. But what I'm concerned about is, of course, that now we are not investing in new personal relationships. So the young master students, the young PhD students now, they don't get that socialization that they got, especially before Corona. Madeleine Redfern.
Thank you. I would be remiss if we didn't actually brought up the issue of science diplomacy or research diplomacy with our indigenous peoples in the Arctic. There's a lot of work that has been done, and I have to, acknowledge and recognize that there is more recognition of the value and the need to include indigenous people from the beginning of the research and not just interviewing our people for our knowledge, scrubbing our identities from that research, especially with the published research, and then having access to it, whether it is the analyzed, published information or document or even the raw data. We've got a long way yet to go because it's not universal, that approach yet. Furthermore, there is the need and the value to actually address the university institutional mindsets and policies that have yet to really do the work necessary to achieve that reconciliation, that partnership. We're hearing more and more about the young researchers who want to come up and work in a much more collaborative, ethical way, but the institutional policies, don't allow them. And I'll give you a real example. I get interviewed a lot. And one of the first things that they want to do is actually sort of, have me sign a waiver, and they say, and by the way, this will be anonymous, you don't have to worry about your name being attached to your words. And I'm like, I want my identity attached to my words. Under no circumstance am I just an Inuk woman from Nunavut or Canada's Arctic or Iqaluit. There are thousands of us, but we are not all one and the same. And that happens a lot. But I do also want to sort of acknowledge, because we spoke yesterday about, what some of the Nordic countries are doing, which is expanding their universities by having these smaller, remote sort of, what do we call those, campuses. We don't have that so much, unfortunately, in Canada. We have now Yukon with one sort of hybrid college university. But the real need and value of having, these are, as far as I'm concerned, sort of almost like embassies, these campuses. They're acts of academic and political diplomacy, because it means that you are closer to the people. People have real access to that research that's being done. We get to, live and cohabit together, learn together, share together. The research is much better when you have that type of approach. So I just want to sort of acknowledge, some of the diplomacy that is being done, that is working, and how much more diplomacy could be done to get to where we need to be.
I see one more hand, but I don't know if we have time to take that. Okay. Yes.
Thank you for finding the time. My name's Tanzeed Alam. I'm the Managing Director of Earth Matters Consulting, and we're based in the UAE, focusing on climate change and environment. So I wanted to ask a question related to science diplomacy and climate change and environment in particular. Obviously, collaboration across space programs has been an area of science diplomacy. And I'm just thinking, what would be your advice to, the UAE being a COP president, in terms of how it can foster that, in terms of tracking progress on mitigation through emissions monitoring and collaboration of different space agencies, as well as in terms of the risks that climate change poses, if it's kind of monitoring heat waves and giving early warnings to countries to prepare for them, especially those that are less able to respond to it, for example. So is there a role there? Is that happening? I'd be curious to hear more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should close for the questions now. And then I would just quick concluding remarks from my fellow panelists and me. Marc, do you have any responses to these two last very interesting questions?
Just on the subject of universities, like having had the experience being in Tromsø and getting to know not only the local community but also the U-Arctic network, I completely agree that the campuses, the main ones, the satellite ones, they do perform a role well beyond education. They really provide centers of not only understanding of knowledge, but also, as you say, they act as embassies. And they're very, very important, not only to understand the situation in the region, but for those outside the region to better understand what is happening. And it's not an accident, by the way, that many observer countries in the Arctic Council, they've made a point to directly connect with these areas of learning as part of their work with the Council. Thanks.
Thank you, Marc. Eyjólfur?
Thank you. 15 minutes. Number one, with regard to the science diplomacy between the Western society of scientific thinking and indigenous people, absolutely understood. Iceland is in a very strange situation since we are settlers. We are not indigenous in the definition of those things, but we are settlers on an island where nobody was before. And we have habited that island now for a little over 1,000 years. But we are sovereign. We control our own fate. And we have created one of the most prosperous societies in the world up there in the north. More to show that it's more than possible. And we have an example. My university, University of Akureyri, is a very small institution with only 2,500 students. But it's been very successful in adapting to online studies, and we have students all around Iceland. But interestingly enough, 7% of our students are Icelanders living abroad because they want to study in their own language. And therefore, I absolutely agree with the comment that we need to have the institutions closer to the people, because that will create a better dialogue, that will create a better foundation of the future research. And I agree with the Greenland Prime Minister, nothing about us without us. So that is very much where we should be heading. And just as an example, University of Akureyri and University of Greenland in Nuuk, we have signed a cooperation on going into online education together, which is something that I'm very excited about. And think about this. Every time that we need to travel east-west in the north, we always have to travel south first. And that becomes very expensive for us to communicate. Just think about it. Now, on the space programs, it's a very interesting question, and I thank you for that question, because I'm not familiar with the natural sciences too much. And I know still that there are a lot of opportunities that would be there. But in terms of safety and social sciences, in terms of warning communities of oncoming dangers, or even cruise ship monitoring, because we know that if cruise ships now sell trips to the North Pole, you can buy a trip with a French cruise liner going to the North Pole. If something happens to that ship, there's absolutely nothing we can do to save it within 48 to 72 hours. So early monitoring of the Arctic is necessary, and that might help with the science diplomacy, because that will also monitor other actions in the Arctic, which is at a sensitive time. So cooperation on that is something, on an international level, is something I would applaud for as a citizen of a small country that doesn't have the ability to save people that are sailing north of us.
Thank you very much, Eyjólfur. And just to conclude for myself to Madeleine Redfern's question, the only thing I will add to my colleagues is the importance of strong institutions in the north, both for local and indigenous communities. And there, of course, in northern Scandinavia, we are privileged with strong institutions, the UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, the Sami University College, Nord University, Umeå University, Luleå, Rovaniemi, Lapland, and Oulu. And that is different in northern Canada. In Alaska, you have a strong state university system. About the space question, I'm usually the pessimistic and negative person that always fear that I won't be invited again for that. But I'm very concerned about space because there is so much dual use capability. So we have more and more space actors, public, private. We have a lot of dual use capability, Earth observation, etc., together with rising levels of conflict. So unfortunately, of course, Russian Western Space Corporation is probably rapidly disappearing. And I have the feeling that there has been very little West-China Space Corporation out of concern for the rise of China. So I think, managing complexities, public, private, and dual use, there will be huge challenges because, of course, there's so much potential for humanity in space. Thank you very much to the organizers for accepting this session, and thank you very much for very good and thought-provoking questions, and thanks to my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.